21 miles. That is the distance separating the Omani Peninsula from the southern coast of Iran at the narrowest point of the Strait of Hormuz. 21 miles of seawater. You can drive 21 miles on a highway in 20 minutes and forget the trip before you even park your car. But this specific strip of water dictates the caloric intake of the global industrial machine. It is the jugular vein of the modern world. We are looking at a geographic anomaly that carries roughly 20% of the world's global oil supply, representing 21 million barrels of crude every single day. The premise we are dissecting today is not a comfortable one. A modern conflict between the United States and Iran has erupted, and the Strait of Hormuz has been sealed shut. Not for a week, not for a tense 48 hours of diplomatic posturing. We are staring down the barrel of a 90-day closure, 3 full months of zero transit. To understand what happens to the world in those 90 days, we first have to strip away the abstractions of economics and look at the physical reality of this choke point. The strait is narrow, but the navigable shipping lanes are even narrower. We are talking about 2 lanes, each just 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone to prevent supertankers from colliding. These vessels are Leviathans. A very large crude carrier, or VLCC, carries 2 million barrels of oil. They are slow, they are unarmored, and they are moving through a corridor flanked by mountainous terrain on the Iranian side, which provides perfect elevated cover for anti-ship missile batteries, radar installations, and asymmetric fast attack craft. The sheer vulnerability of this geography cannot be overstated. When we ask what the importance of the strait is, we are asking what the importance of oxygen is to a long-distance runner. The global economy runs just in time. There are no massive, endless reservoirs of surplus crude sitting idle in every country waiting for a rainy day of this magnitude. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States, the stockpiles in China and Japan, these are shock absorbers. They are meant to smooth over a temporary glitch, a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, a brief pipeline hack. They are not designed to replace the absence of 21 million barrels a day for a quarter of a year. The closure of the strait is the removal of the sun from the solar system of global energy. Everything that orbits it begins to drift into the cold. We have to look at how we built a world so precariously balanced on this one sliver of the Middle East. It was not an accident, but rather a slow, deliberate march toward efficiency over resilience. Since the mid-20th century, the promise of cheap, easily extractable Arabian crude became the foundational assumption of global growth. We built cities around the car. We built supply chains around heavy diesel shipping. We built an agricultural system utterly dependent on petroleum-based fertilizers and diesel-powered tractors. All of it assumed that those ships would keep sliding through that 21-mile gap. When that assumption breaks, the physics of our daily lives break with it. Let us trace the genealogy of this vulnerability. The story of the Strait of Hormuz is the story of how geological lottery tickets shaped 20th and 21st century geopolitics. Deep beneath the sands of the Persian Gulf lies the Ghawar Field, the Burgan Field, the massive reserves of the United Arab Emirates and Iran. These are not just large deposits, they are incredibly cheap to extract compared to offshore deepwater drilling or fracking in the Permian Basin. For decades, the Western world and increasingly the rising economies of Asia struck an implicit bargain. We will buy the cheapest, most abundant energy available, and we will accept the geographical risk of where it comes from. This created a hyper-efficient, highly fragile logistical web. You load up a supertanker at Ras Tanura in Saudi Arabia, and within weeks, that crude is being refined in South Korea, or Japan, or India. The industrial miracles of East Asia were largely fueled by oil flowing out of the Strait of Hormuz. Japan imports roughly 90% of its oil, the vast majority from the Middle East. China, the factory of the world, is heavily dependent on those tankers safely transiting the Indian Ocean. We built a global architecture of trade where the foundation rests on water. But water is only as safe as the naval power that patrols it. For the last several decades, the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, has acted as the guarantor of that flow. The implicit threat was always that if anyone tried to close the strait, the American military would open it by force. This created a false sense of permanence. Markets priced oil as if the strait were an indestructible pipeline rather than a contested waterway. The realization that it is actually a contested waterway changes the fundamental cost of capital everywhere. We are looking at a system that optimized for price and entirely ignored fragility. The concept of redundancy was financially punished. If a nation tried to source all its oil from safer but more expensive domestic alternatives, it lost its competitive edge against nations buying cheap Gulf crude. So everyone went to the Gulf. Everyone accepted the risk. And now, in our scenario, the risk has materialized. The 90-day closure is the bill coming due for a century of geographical complacency. When the flow stops, the historical anomaly of cheap global transit stops with it. The container ships that bring electronics from Shenzhen to Los Angeles, the bulk carriers moving grain from the Americas to Africa, they all run on bunker fuel. And bunker fuel is a direct derivative of the crude sloshing in the bellies of those trapped VLCCs in the Persian Gulf.
We arrive at day 1. The conflict kicks off. Missiles are exchanged. The Iranian military, utilizing its asymmetric naval doctrine, deploys hundreds of smart sea mines into the narrow shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz. They do not need to sink every ship. They only need to sink one. The moment a VLCC takes a hit and begins spilling crude into the water, burning, disabled, the entire commercial shipping industry halts. Lloyd's of London and the massive maritime insurance syndicates instantly revoke coverage for any vessel entering the Persian Gulf. War risk premiums do not just spike, they become prohibitive. A tanker captain will refuse to sail. The unionized crews will refuse to enter the kill zone. The strait is effectively closed, not just by military force, but by the actuarial tables of global insurance. The immediate shockwave hits the commodity markets before the first sun sets. Crude oil shoots past $100, then $150, then $200 a barrel. The algorithms that govern financial markets trigger massive sell-offs in equities. Airlines see their stock prices decimated in hours because fuel is their primary variable cost. But the numbers on the screen are just the shadow of the physical reality unfolding. Within the first 2 weeks, the panic begins to manifest in physical behavior. Strategic petroleum reserves are tapped, but they are released like a slow drip IV into a patient bleeding out from a severed artery. Refineries in Asia, looking at their schedules, realize they only have 20 days of crude sitting in their localized tanks. They begin bidding wars for any cargo currently afloat on the oceans outside the danger zone. A tanker off the coast of West Africa, originally headed to Rotterdam, is suddenly bought by a Chinese state-owned enterprise for an astronomical premium and rerouted. The global market devolves into a desperate, chaotic auction. Governments issue statements calling for calm, but human psychology is hardwired for scarcity. We see the ghost of the 1973 oil shock, but amplified by the speed of modern information. Gas stations experience runs. Hoarding begins. And here is the gray area we must interrogate, the assumption that a state can simply manage a crisis through rationing. You cannot ration a localized panic. Once the public internalizes that the strait is mined and heavily defended, and that a war is ongoing, the belief in a quick resolution evaporates. The first 14 days are characterized by the dawning realization that the cavalry is not coming, or at least the cavalry is going to take months to clear the minefields. As we push into month 2, the mathematical brutality of energy starvation takes hold. 21 million barrels a day. Let us linger on that number. In a 90-day period, that is nearly 2 billion barrels of oil removed from the global economy. You cannot replace 2 billion barrels with wishful thinking, solar panels, or wind turbines. The energy density of oil is what makes modern logistics possible. An electric grid can be powered by alternatives, but the heavy-duty transportation network, the diesel trucks, the cargo ships, the freight trains, cannot instantly pivot away from liquid fuels. The logistics networks begin to fracture. Diesel prices triple. The independent trucker in the American Midwest, the backbone of domestic freight, can no longer afford to fill his tanks. If he operates at a loss, he stops driving. If he stops driving, the grocery store shelves do not get restocked. The cascading failure moves from the fuel pump to the dinner plate. Modern agriculture is essentially the process of turning fossil fuels into food. The tractors require diesel. the natural gas required for Haber-Bosch ammonia synthesis becomes astronomically expensive. Food prices experience violent inflation. We are looking at a scenario where basic caloric stability in import-dependent nations is threatened. The 90-day closure reveals the absolute limits of globalization. Supply chains are stretched tight across oceans, and those tight strings snap under the pressure of energy starvation. Companies that rely on just-in-time manufacturing see their assembly lines grind to a halt because a single component sitting in a factory that cannot afford power is delayed indefinitely. The assumption that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve will save the day is a dangerous fallacy.
The US SPR, even at full capacity, can only release crude at a maximum rate of roughly 4 million barrels a day due to the physical constraints of the pipelines and caverns. And that crude needs to be refined. If the global shortfall is 20 million, releasing 4 million is a band-aid on a bullet wound. The math does not care about political rhetoric. The energy deficit forces governments into draconian measures, forced rationing, prioritizing military and essential agricultural use over civilian transport, and rolling blackouts in nations heavily dependent on imported oil for power generation. The standard of living contracts violently.
We have to shift our lens away from crude oil for a moment, because the Strait of Hormuz holds another hostage: liquefied natural gas. Qatar, a tiny peninsula jutting out into the Gulf, is one of the world's largest exporters of LNG. Every single drop of Qatari LNG must pass through the strait. During this 90-day closure, roughly 20% of the global LNG supply vanishes. This creates a secondary crisis that is arguably more acute than the oil shortage, particularly for Europe and parts of Asia. Europe, having severed many of its pipeline connections to Russian gas, heavily relies on seaborne LNG to heat its homes and power its industrial base. When the Qatari ships stop coming, the European grid faces an existential threat. Natural gas is the critical balancing fuel for the electricity grid. When the wind drops and the sun sets, the gas turbines spin up to prevent blackouts. Without those deliveries, European heavy industry, chemical plants in Germany, steel mills, glass manufacturers, must shut down. We are not talking about temporary furloughs. We are talking about the permanent destruction of industrial capital. Once a glass furnace goes cold, the molten glass solidifies inside, destroying the equipment entirely. The LNG crisis exposes the deep interconnectedness of the energy transition. The bridge fuel is gone. Asian buyers, particularly Japan and South Korea, who have minimal domestic energy resources, enter into an absolute death match with Europe over the remaining LNG cargoes coming from the United States and Australia. The price of gas spikes to unprecedented levels, causing electricity bills to become unpayable for the average citizen. Governments are forced to print money to subsidize the cost of heating, which feeds the inflation spiral.
The 90-day closure demonstrates that you can build all the wind farms you want, but if you do not have the dispatchable baseload power provided by natural gas to back it up, your grid is a fragile house of cards. The cessation of LNG traffic out of the Gulf is a stark reminder that electrons are deeply tethered to molecules, and those molecules are blocked behind a wall of naval mines. Financial contagion becomes the dominant narrative as we reach the midway point of the closure. The global economy is a complex, adaptive system, and energy is the master resource. When the cost of the master resource goes vertical, it triggers a chain reaction of defaults. Airlines go bankrupt first, then the highly leveraged shipping companies, then the agricultural conglomerates struggling with fertilizer and diesel costs. The corporate bond market freezes. Investors, terrified of the uncertainty, dump everything except the safest sovereign debt and precious metals. The central banks are trapped in an impossible paradox. Normally, if the economy faces a massive recessionary shock, a central bank lowers interest rates and prints money to stimulate demand. But this is not a demand shock. This is a supply shock. If you print money and hand it to citizens to help them buy gasoline that does not exist, you simply drive the price of the remaining gasoline to infinity. Inflation rips through the social fabric. The cost of a simple loaf of bread doubles, then triples, because every input, the fertilizer, the tractor fuel, the transport to the mill, the transport to the store, has skyrocketed. The financial crisis bleeds into a sovereign debt crisis for emerging markets. Countries like Pakistan or Sri Lanka, which rely heavily on importing energy priced in US dollars, find their foreign exchange reserves depleted in a matter of weeks. They no longer afford to import fuel, which means their power grids collapse, which leads to immediate social unrest. The wealthy nations outbid the poorer nations for whatever oil is left on the water. The brutal reality of energy imperialism reasserts itself. The 90 days prove that global equity is an illusion when the lights go out.
Capital flees to the jurisdictions with the most secure energy supplies, fundamentally rewriting the financial hierarchy of the world. The destruction of wealth is staggering, wiping out trillions of dollars in market capitalization and pension fund value, as the realization sets in that the era of uninterrupted growth was a temporary phenomenon enabled by a highly vulnerable maritime corridor.
As the crisis deepens, we must examine the geopolitical realignments, the shadow side of who benefits from this catastrophe. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not a disaster for everyone. For Russia, already isolated by Western sanctions, a 90-day closure is a profound strategic windfall. Russian Urals crude, normally sold at a heavy discount to China and India, suddenly becomes the most coveted commodity on the planet. The leverage Moscow gains over Beijing and New Delhi is immense. Russia essentially becomes the indispensable energy lifeline for the Asian giants, cementing a Eurasian axis that the West has long feared. In the United States, the dynamic is deeply paradoxical. The U.S. is a major producer of oil and gas, primarily from the shale fields of Texas and the Dakotas. Domestic producers see record-shattering profits. But because oil is a globally priced commodity, American consumers still suffer the agony of the price spike unless the U.S. government takes the radical step of banning energy exports to keep domestic prices down. If Washington does that, it abandons its allies in Europe and Asia to the mercy of the market, destroying decades of diplomatic trust. China faces absolute strategic panic. The Malacca dilemma, China's long-standing fear that its maritime supply lines could be severed, is fully realized. Beijing realizes it cannot project enough naval power into the Indian Ocean to force the strait open against Iranian asymmetric defenses. This accelerates China's drive to build overland pipelines through Central Asia and Russia, fundamentally shifting the map of global energy infrastructure away from the oceans and onto the Eurasian landmass. The Middle East itself is completely transformed. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, watching their primary source of revenue trapped behind a war zone, recognize that the American security umbrella failed to prevent the unthinkable. They will seek new guarantors of their security, perhaps moving closer to Beijing, demanding technology transfers and military hardware in exchange for preferential oil contracts once the strait eventually reopens. The 90-day closure acts as a massive centrifuge, accelerating the fragmentation of the global order.
The question inevitably arises, why does it take 90 days? Why doesn't the United States military simply sail in and open the strait on day 3? This is where we must dissect the technical mechanics of asymmetric naval warfare. The Strait of Hormuz is not the open ocean where an American carrier strike group can maneuver with impunity. It is a confined, shallow bathtub. The Iranian military doctrine is built entirely around anti-ship and area denial, known as A2AD. They have spent decades embedding thousands of anti-ship cruise missiles into the hardened caves of the Zagros Mountains overlooking the strait. These are mobile, easily hidden, and incredibly lethal. In addition, the waters are saturated with smart mines. These are not just contact mines from the Second World War. They are acoustic and magnetic anomaly detectors that rest on the seafloor, waiting for the specific acoustic signature of an aircraft carrier or a supertanker before launching upward. Clearing a minefield in a contested environment is arguably the most difficult naval operation in existence. Minesweepers are slow, vulnerable targets. You cannot clear the mines while you are being shot at by coastal artillery and swarms of fast attack craft armed with torpedoes. Therefore, you must first destroy the missile batteries. But the missile batteries are hidden in deep tunnels. This requires a massive, sustained air campaign, which takes weeks to organize and execute.
Even after the perceived destruction of the coastal defenses, no commercial shipping company will send a billion-dollar tanker into the strait until the area is declared absolutely free of mines. The process of sweeping and verifying every square inch of those shipping lanes takes months.
The 90-day timeline is not an exaggeration of military failure. It is a realistic assessment of the friction of modern, highly lethal combat in confined geography. The realization that raw tonnage and aircraft carriers cannot instantly solve a geographical choke point shatters the myth of absolute maritime supremacy. The technical reality of naval mines dictates the pace of the global economic recovery, and those mines are patient.
We arrive at the shadow side of the aftermath. There is a strong temptation to view this crisis as the ultimate catalyst for the green energy transition. The logic seems sound. If fossil fuels are this vulnerable, the world will aggressively rapidly transition to renewables to ensure sovereign energy security. But we have to actively resist this neat, tidy resolution. The reality is far more brutal and contradictory. A 90-day closure of the Strait of Hormuz does not accelerate the green transition. It likely sets it back a decade. Why? Because the transition to wind, solar, and battery storage requires immense amounts of cheap capital, globalized supply chains, and industrial capacity. You need diesel to mine the lithium and copper. You need bunker fuel to ship the solar panels from factories in Asia to installations in Europe or America. When the global economy suffers a heart attack, the capital required to fund a multi-trillion-dollar energy transition evaporates. Governments, faced with angry populations freezing in the dark and paying double for food, abandon long-term climate goals in favor of immediate caloric and thermal survival. We see an aggressive return to coal. Germany, India, China, they all fire up every dormant coal plant they possess because coal is domestic, cheap, and does not require passage through the Persian Gulf. The environmental regulations are stripped away in the name of national emergency. The crisis destroys the cooperative international framework necessary to manage climate change. Nations turn inward, hoarding resources, prioritizing raw survival over collective environmental stewardship. The gray area here is the realization that energy security and environmental sustainability can, under severe stress, become diametrically opposed forces. The shock does not teach us to live without oil. It teaches us to acquire oil by any means necessary, reinforcing the deep, primal reliance on high-density hydrocarbons to keep the fragile veneer of civilization intact.
D91 arrives. The hostilities cease. The political agreements are signed in some neutral capital, and the first minesweepers declare the central lane of the Strait of Hormuz safe for transit. The first VLCC, heavily escorted by destroyers, slowly makes its way out into the Gulf of Oman. The oil begins to flow again. The immediate panic subsides. Oil prices drop from their astronomical peaks, and the stock market rallies. But the synthesis of this deep dive is understanding that the world on day 91 is permanently fractured. We do not go back to normal. The psychology of the global supply chain has been profoundly traumatized. The illusion of safety is gone. Every corporate boardroom, every Ministry of Defense, every central bank now prices in the possibility of it happening again. The cultural ripple effect is a massive systemic retreat from the hyperglobalization of the late 20th century. Supply chains are restructured for resilience rather than efficiency, meaning everything costs more permanently. The baseline rate of inflation is structurally elevated. Nations accelerate the duplication of industrial bases, retreating into regional trading blocs. The era of a seamless, borderless global economy, lubricated by the cheap transit of Persian Gulf crude, is definitively closed. We learned that geography is not dead, it is merely resting, waiting to exert its influence on human ambition. The Strait of Hormuz remains, a 21-mile vulnerability, a silent monument to our collective dependence. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of the fragile arteries of our world. If this kind of analysis resonates with you, I invite you to share this episode with someone who values looking past the surface.
Share it directly, listener to listener, because these conversations are how we make sense of the complex systems we all inhabit. Until next time, keep interrogating the assumptions that